The Cooler Master C700P fits the Cosmos lineage, but has some new designs that attempt to modernize a case once fit for the supertower market. Integrated RGB LEDs in the top and bottom panels are part of this, as is the decision to opt for tempered glass. But new features also make an appearance. Modularity, for instance, creates an inverted or rotated layout for stack effect cooling or just for inversion, and are present solutions in modernizing that design. This is also painstakingly slow to execute, but it gives you something different. The shrouds are also fully present now to flank all ugly aspects of the case, and an abundance of filters also fit the modern case design requirements. Before getting to that, this video is brought to you by Synergy, the software that lets you share a keyboard and mouse between multiple systems. If you have limited desk space and multiple computers to command, Synergy removes the need for separate peripherals or a KVM and works as over-the-network software. Use our link below to get 50% off the Home or Pro version with SSL. So we kind of already reviewed this case when we did our PAX West build, but now we have more home base opinions on it. We have some thermal numbers, noise numbers, things like that. And before getting any further, I want to point out, if the lighting is a little bit different from normally, if it seems like this side has less light hitting me than you're used to, it's because this case is so massive that we can't really reasonably get the lights to shine over it from that corner. This thing is huge. So it's one of the biggest cases we've worked with lately, perhaps rivaling the View 71, the Be Quiet, Dark Base Pro 900 White Edition. If we put all three of those cases right here, you wouldn't be able to see me. So it's big. In fact, it's so big that Cooler Master wasn't sure how big it was. When the case first launched, their website listed the weight as about 57 pounds or 26.2 kilograms. Presently, they've updated the site. It's now 48 to 50 pounds, somewhere in there. So regardless of which size you take, it's heavy. And maneuvering this thing while building is one of the bigger challenges. But fortunately, you only have to build in a case once, normally. So not the biggest problem. And people who want this kind of case know what they're getting into. But just be aware that once it's built and it weighs 70 or 80 pounds, you're probably going to want to move the thing into other rooms for testing yourself rather than have employees do it, because you don't want injury claims. So keep that in mind if you're in the business of reviews. But this thing, I mean, this is generally how you move it once it has a system inside of it. You're going to lean it back and then pivot it. And this is where some of the design elements that Cooler Master's invested in here actually pay off. So I've seen two sides of what people think of these rails. Some think they look stupid and look like sled components or skis, and some think they're awesome. Regardless of what you think from a aesthetic standpoint, from a practicality and function standpoint, they're actually really good. They're bolted into the chassis, so not going to break off. You can lift the thing and carry it like this if you wanted to, and they also serve as a means to lift it where you're not going to rip components off like that. Because if you did that, you lift it from the back, it's going to suck if this thing comes off and you don't realize it's going to come off and you drop the whole computer. So as you'll see soon, this is part of Cooler Master's kind of present design tropes, where they've got these thinner, cheaper plastic panels that attach in places like the front or the back or the top in some instances, that come off very easily, again, but provide some kind of visual, I don't know, accoutrement. It's some kind of visual extra that helps round out the case in this instance, but also you don't pick it up there because you will lose a foot when you drop it. All that aside though, the case actually obviously is pretty easy to build in for the most part. It's a large case, so it's kind of hard to screw that up. Easy to put things where they belong. It gets a little more difficult when you want to invert it or rotate it for stack effect cooling, which is something we haven't really seen since the Raven 02 did it with Silverstone a long time ago. But those rotation and inversion jobs do take some time. The first time you do it, plan to spend about 45 minutes figuring it out, removing all the panels, putting them back in, things like that. Once you've got it done, it's not as bad. But just be aware that the extra build time required is there. Again, though, you probably only do that once, so it's not the biggest thing to complain about in the world. And there aren't a lot of major things to complain about on the case. We actually liked it overall. We tend to like these bigger cases. It's got some really good features up here. Dust panel for one, very easy to remove and easy to clean, but also underneath here is a mounting cage for radiators and fans. So if you wanted to, it's only 2 screws to access it. You pull both out, you pull the cage out, and then you can mount your rad or your fans and reinstall it all in one piece. So that's actually really nice, as you'll find, because the case is so big that if you're working on it on a table like this, it kind of sucks to keep doing this and trying to screw stuff in. So they've thought that through, and you can remove pieces to build it kind of all modularly on the table and then reassemble it. In fact, they've done it to an extent that you can pull the motherboard tray out, build on the tray, reinsert the tray with the motherboard on it, and keep building. That doesn't apply if you have big tower coolers, but you get the idea. So, kind of cool in a lot of ways, kind of silly in a lot of ways, but that's what you get with what is effectively a super tower. Let me just exaggerate how tall this is. Hang on. Okay. You know what? Good enough. You can't see the back of it because it's so tall, so you don't know that it's not lined up properly. Yeah, I don't know. Let's go through some of Patrick's build notes, and then we'll go through the thermals and noise. So for Patrick's notes, he says, although the C700P does have a large glass side panel, the default layout obscures much of the interior, making the external LEDs the focus. The power supply shroud and a large plate of metal hiding the hard drive and optical drive bays can be removed to make internal components fully visible, but the case won't fully benefit from flashy LED fans if you were to buy them. Even the top panel has a double layer of mesh that would obscure such things. The fans Cooler Master ships with the case are plain and functional, much like the focus of this case. It's going after functionality over anything else. The panel includes some basic controls for case lighting, which can optionally be synced with the motherboard, and fan speed as well. There are labeled LEDs to indicate the current settings, and you can toggle them by pushing the physical buttons on the outside of the case. Fan speed can either be high or low, which means 12 volts or 7 volts, and I/O consists of a single USB 3.1 Type-C port sandwiched between 4 USB 3.0 or 3.1 Gen 1 if you prefer ports, and standard 3.5mm headphone and mic jacks beneath. We expect to see some more high-end cases following suit and not bothering with 2.0 as time goes on, but this is still among the first to do it. One of the strong points of the massive full towers we reviewed recently, like the Dark Base Pro 900, the View 71 TG, for example, is that they dwarf the ATX board we use for testing and leave plenty of room for coolers and cable management. The power supply is held above the floor of the case and has ample clearance on all sides, even with the shroud installed. There's plenty of room for cables. There's a steel plate that screws on under the side panel to keep things secure without relying on the side panel to mash everything down. And generally, cabling has been decently thought out in this case. The size goes hand in hand with one of the weak points, though, which is that they're practically impossible to maneuver, these cases. The C700P wasn't quite as heavy as we initially thought, as we noted earlier. It's still 50 pounds, though, and you can't exactly casually flip it around during the build process, so we left the case completely stationary and installed the motherboard and GPU without laying it on its side, which is quite a feat, especially with the particularly difficult to access PCIe screws. The metal handles on the Cosmos cases are typically more aesthetic than functional, but in this instance they were useful for hauling the case between rooms. Each is made of solid aluminum and held in place with 4 screws. The front panel has hardly any room for ventilation at all, something we were worried about as soon as we saw the case, but we'll test that in a moment. There's a thin plastic panel covering a mesh filter underneath, which is backed by an even finer mesh. The top and bottom filters are constructed in the same sturdy but potentially restrictive manner, and there are 3 140mm fans included with the case, listed as 1200 RPM, shipped in the lower 2 front slots and the rear exhaust slot. For additional testing this time, we chose to remove the front panel and then the front panel and filter, and finally to test the case normally but with the fans shifted up 1 slot to direct more air over the power supply shroud rather than into it. For once, removing the front panel is actually a viable option for users. The only indication that something has been removed is the 2 small slots to slot the thing into. Users with optical drives may wish to remove this panel regardless of cooling performance to avoid swinging it outwards every time the disk tray opens. Starting with thermals specific to the C700P case, where we reconfigured the enclosure a few different ways, We see stock configuration CPU load temperature and torture tests at 54.1 degrees Celsius over ambient, with idle at 4.4 degrees Celsius over ambient. This is with the CPU mainly cooled by the exhaust fan and tower cooler. The two intake fans are installed in the bottom of the case by default, and neither is on the vertical level of our CPU cooler. So one pushes from the bottom front into the PSU shroud, and the other pushes from the middle front into the middle of the case. Surprisingly, moving the front fan up didn't have a significant impact on the CPU temperature. We expected more air to be moved above the GPU this way, but it seems like Cooler Master did their research and chose the stock fan layout well, at least for our configuration. The front panel restricts enough air at the top that it just really didn't impact much, as most of the air is coming from the center of the front panel anyway. Relocating the bottom fan to the top intake position produced effectively identical thermal results as stock, and removing the front panel did reduce temperature by about 2 degrees Celsius, and then removing the filter lowered it further by 3.3 degrees Celsius additionally. This drops down to 48.8 Celsius delta T over ambient, and it seems like the double thick mesh filter blocks at least as much air as the solid plastic panel. So if you wanted to improve cooling by a few degrees for an intensive render project, it'd be easy to just remove the front panel and leave the filter in place. Here's a chart with the comparative numbers for the C700P and other cases. We've seen stock temperature deltas around 54 degrees Celsius in both the View 71 with an extra fan and the stock Meshify C lately. It's not exceptional, but it's a very reasonable range. Cooler Master's 52.1 degrees Celsius delta T over ambient without the front panel is competitive with the Corsair 270R and pushes the C700P into the range of cases we consider well cooled. The case ends up between the Meshify C and View 71 ultimately, and only starts getting seriously outmatched once we venture into more cooling-oriented configurations like the RL06. Looking at Cosmos-only GPU thermals for a torture workload, GPU delta T was 50.4 degrees Celsius with two intake fans pushing air along the bottom of the case. The lowest fan is mostly encompassed by the power supply shroud in stock configuration, but Cooler Master's shroud isn't fully sealed, and the additional airflow still benefits components outside of it. Moving the front fan up didn't do the GPU any favors, and the DT was raised by about 2 degrees Celsius with the decrease in air towards it. Removing the front panel was much more helpful though, lowering delta T over ambient by 2.7 degrees Celsius and a further 4.4 Celsius with the filter removed as well. Comparatively, 50.4 degrees Celsius was already an impressively low temperature for our tests, near the performance of the Roswell Coleman, but taking the front panel off lowered the temperature below anything on our chart except for the RL06. Again, removing the filter isn't really a realistic scenario because, well, obviously your front of the case is exposed, but it does show how much room there is for improvement. If there were only one layer of mesh, this could easily have beaten Silverstone's case. Cooler Master's C700P stock fan configuration permits the case to perform exceptionally well with GPU thermals, considering the closed-off, low-noise front panel. The case marginally outperforms its fellow behemoths, the Be Quiet Darkbase Pro 900 and Thermaltake View 71. Moving on to 3D Mark testing for some realistic scenarios, the stock C700P kept the GPU delta down to 55 degrees Celsius during a Firestrike Extreme stress test, just a bit higher than Thermaltake's Core P3. Removing the front panel would undoubtedly lower this further, but the stock GPU cooling performance already looks pretty good compared to other cases on our charts. Rendering a Blender test file on the CPU DT reached 38.3 degrees Celsius, on par with the functional but forgettable Silverstone KL07. GPU cooling performance was also good to middling, with a DT of 27.2 degrees Celsius when rendering on the GPU. This backs up the torture test's conclusions that the C700P has good but not incredible stock cooling, and that this extends to real-world scenarios. With the fans at full speed and in stock configuration, the C700P is on the noisy end of the scale at 38.2 dBA, with the S340 Elite and Meshify C nearby. This case does have an external fan control though, so there's a convenient way to instantly drop that noise level when the system is idling. The front panel of the C700P contains a sheet of acoustic foam, which apparently does a pretty good job, since removing it but leaving the mesh filter in place raises the noise level audibly to 42.1 dBA. The optimal balance of cooling and noise depends on user preference, but leaving the front panel off and the fan set to low until necessary would be a good compromise. Overall, it's a decent case. It's just $300 is a lot of money, and at $300, you really need to be perfect for the user looking for a case, to be worth purchasing. We can't make that decision fully for you. We can present as much of it as possible, but ultimately you have to look at the thing, and that's up to you. So in this range, we would recommend looking at the Be Quiet Dark Base Pro 900. It's a little bit cheaper and is pretty much the same size. It might be worth looking at the View 71. It's a lot cheaper than this, but it's a slightly different market as well. There are plenty of options from companies like Leon Lee and Inwin in this price category. That tends to be where they reside for the most part. So really just pull up their entire catalog because half of it's going to be in this price range. But what it comes down to is why do you want it? Do you want it for a sort of home-based server solution? Because if that's the case, it's workable. It's just there are a lot of features you might not want, and that's true for a lot of these cases that are this size and this price. Inverting the case is something you do once. If you really want an inverted case, it might be worth looking back in time at the Silverstone Raven 02, or maybe the Corsair 600C, which is much cheaper, but it's inverted, and that's the only layout you get. So it's going to be cheaper because it doesn't require the tooling this has to offer 3 different orientations for the board. And we did build with it inverted at the PAX West build event we did. It's fine. It's just, it takes some time to do it. So expect that as well. The $300 cost, just to kind of put this out there, isn't an unfair price. It's just a high price. You look at the tooling that goes into this thing, tooling on cases like this can cost easily upwards of $600,000, depending on which company you're talking to. And I don't know what the tooling to this costs, but I know what tooling costs for a lot of other cases on the market, and it's not unreasonable to be in the $500,000 to $1 million range, depending on what the case is, depending on how much they can pull from the previous version of the case and reuse, things like that. So it makes sense. It's an expensive case. They've got tempered glass on here that's curved, which has questionable yield. We're not sure how many of these they're able to actually ultimately put on the case, but it's not 10 out of 10. I can tell you that much. So that's why the price is high. But yeah, I mean, it's really not a bad case. It's just expensive. So that's kind of up to you at this point. There are plenty of alternatives at lower prices, though, if this is too much for you. So that's all for this one. As always, you can go to patreon.com/gamersnexus to help us out directly. You can go to store.gamersnexus.net to pick up a shirt like this one. Subscribe for more. Hopefully the lighting and the audio will be better in the next one if you don't like them in this one, because we won't have this thing here to soak up half of my audio and 1/3 of my lights. I'll see you all next time.